of Genesis. Today we begin with chapter 36, but I'd like to tie up the last verses of chapter 35. We didn't get to finish completely, and I like to finish the whole book, the whole work. But anyway, verse 27 of chapter 35, the last three verses of this chapter, we like to add that to our study. Jacob came unto Isaac, his father, unto Mamre, unto the city of Arba, which is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac sojourned. Jacob, he had been back in the land of Canaan for several years by this time, evidently. But we have no information from the scriptures as to whether he had seen his father up to this time. That's mentioned here in verse 27, which is interesting. We would think that he would have made plans to visit his father soon after returning to the land of promise, but we have no record of it, biblical record. Surely he had, but again, we don't know. Mr. Gill mentioned, John Gill, no mention being made of his mother. It is very probable she was dead. And Isaac being alone and very old, and the time of his death drawing nigh, he might send for Jacob to come with his family and be with him, for it can hardly be thought that this was the first time of Jacob's visiting his father since he came into the land of Canaan, which must be about 10 years. But as yet he had not come with his father, come with his family to him, and in order to abide with him. So that's the views or the thoughts and the comments of Mr. Gill. David Guzik, he said more than 20 years ago, Jacob left his home thinking his father's death was at hand. And now, quite unexpectedly, he has the opportunity to see his father one last time before his death. We should remember our times are in God's hands. We may expect a long or short life for others or ourselves and be quite wrong. Only God knows. His father Isaac, there seemed to be nothing dramatic between Isaac and Jacob at this meeting. It was possible Isaac was incapacitated by old age. Again, some opinions, thoughts from others concerning this time and event. And then the last two verses, 28 and 29, the days of Isaac were 180 years. He lived 40 years after he had made his will and blessed his two sons. And Jacob was now 120 years of age, being born when his father was 60. So that would make Jacob 120 years of age. And Joseph was now 29 years of age. So that Isaac lived 12 years after the selling of Joseph into Egypt. He was 5 years older than his father Abraham was when he died. That's, again, John Gill's view or thought. But anyway, verse 29 says, and Isaac gave up the ghost and died and was gathered unto his people, being old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So it's an interesting climax, if you will, of this chapter and of the relationship here going on. The sons had made reconciliation with one another. We studied about that already, which Isaac, no doubt Isaac knew about it, but again, we don't know. And now they joined together to bury their father which must have been a very emotional time. Again, there's no mention of Rebekah. We're confronted with more questions with this passage. These last two verses are out of order and placed here for the record's sake. At least that's the opinion of many. But anyway, let me share in closing this chapter 35 some comments from first of all from Scott. Scott wrote, Joseph was 30 years of age when he stood before Pharaoh. Genesis 41, 46. After the 7 years of plenty and 2 or 3 years of famine, Jacob told Pharaoh that he was 130. Genesis 47 and 9. Jacob must have been about 90 when Joseph was born and about 75 at this time. And as Isaac was 60 when Esau and Jacob were born, he must have been 135 or 6 years of age. Now, another comment, what was written about this passage. The age, death, and burial of Isaac are here inserted by anticipation, for by computation, we find that he did not die till about the time that Joseph stood before Pharaoh. Isaac was about 150 years old when Joseph was born. Joseph, therefore, must have been 30 when Isaac was 180. And one more comment in closing. Jamieson Fawcett Brown writes, the death of this venerable patriarch is here recorded by anticipation, for it did not take place till 15 years after Joseph's disappearance. Fear and blind though he was, he lived to a very advanced age, and it is a pleasing evidence of the permanent reconciliation between Esau and Jacob that they met at Mamre to perform the funeral rites of their common father. Some interesting closing remarks here. The reason I want to deal with them and not leave them out of our study, but interesting. The two boys get together, and again, as far as the remainder, that's something that we're not clear on in our study. And taking up with chapter 36, we direct our attention to Esau. In verse 1, it says, now these are the generations of Esau, who is Edom. Moses, in his record here of writing, he pauses, it seems, in his history, in recording the history of Abraham, particularly of Jacob, of which we've been studying here in the last few verses, to record the history of Esau. After all, in the lineage of Abraham, although he was not chosen to share in that lineage from which Messiah would be born, we have here inserted, as it were, the story of Esau. Throughout this chapter, I'm going to share some comments from others who were more involved in the historical aspect of that era in the time of Esau. For instance, the biblical illustrator says this chapter is a kind of leave-taking of Esau and his posterity. The stream of sacred history leads on to the Messiah, the flower and perfection of our human race. Scripture history is written upon this principle, that it was God's design throughout to bring his only begotten Son into the world, and therefore that family alone in which he is to appear shall have a prominent record. And then Matthew Henry says, the registers in this chapter show the faithfulness of God to his promise to Abraham. Esau is here called Edom, that name which kept up the remembrance of his selling his birthright for a mess of pottage. Esau continued the same profane despiser of heavenly things. The end of quote. Esau was not a worshiper of Jehovah like Isaac and Jacob were. He became idolatrous. In verse 2, Esau took his wives of the daughters of Canaan, Adah, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and Aholibamah, the daughter of Anna, the daughter of Zibeon the Hivite. The name and line of the wicked are mentioned by God's Spirit for distinction, not for honor to them. This is Mr. Hughes, and he wrote, the name and line of the wicked are mentioned by God's Spirit. It is for distinction, not for honor, not to give them honor, just to include them in the history. Horites, Hittites, Hivites are the national titles of the same sort of sinful people. Uncleanness and unnaturalness are recorded in the wicked's line to make them stink. A numerous progeny with dignity may be the portion of the wicked here below. Affinity with persons that are wicked usually brings souls to affinity with their sins. In verse 3, let me just read some verses here. Verse 3, Bashemath, Ishmael's daughter, sister of Nebajoth. Verse 4, Adah bare to Esau Eliphaz, and Bashemath bare Reuel. Verse 5, and Aholibamah bare Jeush, Jolam, Korah. These are the sons of Esau, which were born unto him in the land of Canaan. Mr. Gill writes, these are the sons of Esau, which were born to him in the land of Canaan, and we do not read of any born to him elsewhere. So that all his wives, which some think were 4, or others 5, he had but 5 sons. What daughters he had is not related. In verse 6, Esau took his wives and his sons and his daughters, and all the persons of his house and his cattle, and all his beasts and all his substance, which he had got in the land of Canaan, and went into the country from the face of his brother Jacob. So there appears that Esau and Jacob dwelt together for a while, at least in Canaan, whether the former removed from Seir, probably soon after Jacob returned to the promised land. That they were on the most friendly footing, I think this sufficiently proves. Mr. Clark writes, and Esau shows the same dignified conduct as on other occasions in leaving Canaan to Jacob and returning again to Mount Seir, certainly a much less fruitful region than that which he now, in behalf of his brother, voluntarily abandoned. In verse 7, their riches were more than they might dwell together, and the land wherein they were strangers could not bear them because of their cattle. So obviously, this as well points out, although we're not told, it obviously points out that Esau and Jacob dwelt together. But like it was in the time of Abraham, their 2 possessions were so large they had to separate company, just as Abraham did from the company that he had to, or they had to separate because of the such a large gathering. Mr. Gill says the land wherein they were strangers could not bear them because of their cattle were so numerous that they could not get pasturage for them. There was not enough left them by the inhabitants of it for them to occupy. And then verses 8 and 9, thus dwelt Esau at Mount Seir, Esau in Edom. Esau is Edom. Let me say that Edom becomes the name by which Esau is recognized, as well as the country, the place where they live. Verse 9, these are the generations of Esau, the father of the Edomites in Mount Seir. Now, again, Mr. Guzik, he wrote what I thought is interesting. Esau, the father of the Edomites, Edom and the Edomites are mentioned some 130 times in the Bible. They were an important group of neighbors to Israel. When the Israelites came through the wilderness to the land of promise in the time of Moses, the Edomites was one of those groups that refused them to have passage through their land. You'll find that in Numbers chapter 20. This was a source of discouragement, of course, for the people. Even so, God commanded special regard for the Edomites among Israel. He said in Deuteronomy 23 and 7, you shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. In the days of Saul, Edom was made subject to Israel, and David established garrisons there, 2 Samuel 8. But later, in the days of Joram, the son of Ahab, the Edomites became independent of Israel, 2 Kings chapter 8. Several of the prophets spoke about and spoke against Edom, including Jeremiah chapter 49, as well as Ezekiel in chapter 25. Now, Herod the Great, the one who tried to kill those young children under the age of 20 in Bethlehem, was an Edomite. And from the time of Islam, he conquered the Middle East. The region has been virtually unoccupied, except for a few Bedouins and military outposts. It has been brought to nothing. As Obadiah prophesied, in fact, the entire book of Obadiah records an extended prophecy against Edom. So Edom's mentioned several times in several places. And then verse 10, these are the names of Esau's sons, Eliphaz, the son of Adah, the son of the wife of Esau, Reuel of Bathshemath, the wife of Esau. Verse 11, the sons of Eliphaz were Teman, Omar, Zepho, and Gatam, and Kenaz. Verse 12, Timnah was concubine to Eliphaz, Esau's son. She bare to Eliphaz Amalek. These were the sons of Adah, Esau's wife. Now, verse 13, these are the sons of Reuel, Nahath, and Zerah, and Shammah, and Mizah. These were the sons of Bathshemath, Esau's wife. Verse 14, these were the sons of Aholibamah, the daughter of Anna, the daughter of Zibeon, Esau's wife. And she bare to Esau Jeush, Jalem, and Korah. And verse 15, these are the dukes of the sons of Esau. And on it reads. And verse 17, verse 16 speaks about Duke Korah, mentioning the various dukes, Duke Korah, Duke Gadam, Duke Amalek. And then in verse 17, verse 17, these are the sons of Reuel, Esau's son. And then it mentions some more dukes. I'm not going to take the time to read them. In verse 18, it mentions more dukes from the sons of Aholibamah. In verse 19, these are the sons of Esau, who is Edom, and these are their dukes. Dukes. Dukes were somebody that had some position under Edom. In verse 20, these are the sons of Seir, the Horite, who inhabited the land, Lotan and Shobal and Zibeon. The Horites were the original inhabitants of the country of Seir. It was called the land of the Horites, and afterwards the land of the Idumeans, when the descendants of Esau had driven them out. We find them first mentioned in chapter 14 of Genesis and verse 6. And then again from verse 22 down through verse 30. We're not going to read those verses, but it's just the children of, and mentions the various names or the names of the many children here. These are the dukes. And then in verse 30, it mentions again the dukes, the last ones, the last dukes. And then in verse 31, these are the kings that reigned in the land of Edom before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. So there being no kings over Israel until many years after the times of Moses. And so here we have some thought, if you will, that these words written here by Moses were inserted, according to Mr. Gill, that's his opinion, by some other writer. We don't know that, but according to John Gill and others, that seems to be the occasion. But there's no need really to suppose what you can't read about and know for sure, or at least have a good idea for. Moses knew about, Mr. Gill points out, he knew about foregoing prophecies and promises that kings would arise out of them and reign over them. He wrote that in Genesis 17 about it. This was, and this he was so certain of that Moses himself, by divine direction, gave laws and rules to the children of Israel respecting their future kings in Deuteronomy chapter 17. And besides, as Mr. Gill points out, Moses himself was king in Jeshurun, or if you will, Israel, in Deuteronomy 33 and verse 5. So that's the same as if he had said, these are the kings that reigned in Edom before this time. So it's interesting, some of these writings that we have that are not clear to us. It's not verse after verse after verse that are written chronologically. Sometimes they are written, a good example of that, of course, is the book of Revelation. That's not written chronologically. Mr. Clark, Adam Clark, he as well shared this kind of opinion that Mr. Gill did. And I quote from him, I suppose all the verses from Genesis 36, 31 through 39 inclusive have been transferred to this place from First Chronicles chapter 1, verses 43 through 50, as it is not likely they could have been written by Moses, and it is quite possible they might have been at a very early period written in the margin of an authentic copy to make out the regal succession in Edom prior to the consecration of Saul, which words being afterwards found in the margin of a valuable copy from which others were transcribed, were supposed by the copyist to be a part of the text, which, having been omitted by the mistake of the original writer, had been since added to make up the deficiency. On this conviction, he would not hesitate to transcribe them consecutively in his copy. Again, the opinion of Mr. Clark as to what happened. One of those things that we'll understand better by and by, let me say. Verse 32, Bela, the son of Beor, reigned in Edom, and the name of his city was Dinhabah. Verse 33, and Bela died, and Jobab, the son of Zerah of Basra, reigned in his stead. And again, Clark says, many have supposed that Jobab is the same as Job. So remarkable for his afflictions and patience, and that Eliphaz was the same who in the book of Job is called one of his friends. But there is no proper proof of this, and there are many reasons against it. These are the words of Clark. Again, we don't know about Job. Again, we might think, oh, here he is. Clark mentioned some feel that he is found here and part of this family of the Edomites, of Esau, the lineage of this man, Esau, Edom, as he became known later. But again, we don't know. We are told by more than one or a few that Job is the oldest book in our Bible, the oldest book. And there's different reasons for thinking this by just reading the book of Job, what's mentioned and what is not mentioned in the book of Job would give strength to the fact that he wasn't around until a certain time, or he was not involved in the time of Moses, the time of some of the other people, that his book was among the original, if you will, the first writings. But again, I say the first writings must have been, but we don't know that much. But he was obviously one of the very interesting characters in our Bible. Why? And again, I know we mentioned this somewhat before in our studies, but why they changed or inserted, maybe that's the right word, the books in the order that they did, I don't know. Our Bible was separated verse by verse, chapter by chapter, long after the last apostle John died. Someone in later time, I even forget his name right now, but he was the one that they were the ones that decided to separate the books and the verses. Otherwise, they'd just be all put together like they were in the original writings. But it's interesting. We don't know the exact conclusion, if you will. Verses 34 and 35 says, Jobab died, and Husham of the land of Temani reigned in his stead. And Husham died, and Hadad, the son of Bedad, who smote Midian in the field of Moab, reigned in his stead. And the name of his city was Aviv. But again, some interesting thoughts concerning this final writings of Esau. The fact that Esau and Jacob did spend some time together is interesting. And they separated because of the hugeness, the greatness, the largeness of their crowd, their cattle, goats, and sheep, and camels, and whatever. But anyway, it's interesting to note after all these years that they were able to mend the fences and love one another. And then I guess the most touching thing, as far as I'm concerned, is to share together in the burying of their father Isaac. That is a touching thing. Amen. God bless you. Our time is gone another day so quickly. We pray God's blessings on Brother Michael, Sister Jacqueline, the family, and that the Lord smile upon the church at Dewa, that many more souls be added to the kingdom because of your efforts. God bless.